I believe I've heard Trump say, let's just think about Russia and Ukraine for the moment. I believe I've heard him say on different occasions that if he were president, the war would be over or
it wouldn't have happened.
Or it wouldn't have happened. On the other hand, I have looked pretty extensively at both candidates' online platforms. They're very fuzzy. But Harris says that she plans to very much invest in the military, to ensure that we have this dominant foothold in the global space. So I'm wondering, though, which president or which candidate would you want to see in control of these sorts of situations, and why?
I think we have to assume some continuity from Biden to Harris. She's been in this administration, and it's not as if at any point in this election campaign since she became the candidate, she's criticized the foreign policy of Joe Biden. So we would get more of the same, I think, at best. And that would take the form of continuing to support Ukraine enough that Ukraine doesn't lose the war, but not enough for it to win, which in my view leads ultimately to defeat. There are very few ties in war. It's not like soccer. And I think if you don't give Ukraine sufficient support now, Russia's going to grind out a win in the next couple of years. One of the striking features of the Biden-Harris administration has been their use of the word de-escalation. They love that word. Anything that's going on in the world, whether it's in Ukraine or Israel, there's always going to be de-escalation. But I came to realize in the course of the last couple of years that de-escalation is functionally the opposite of deterrence. I mean, if you put yourself back in the schoolyard where people were occasionally, at least in my day, throwing punches, when somebody punched you in the mouth, you didn't reply by saying, let's de-escalate, because that would get you the next punch in the mouth. I think we've forgotten the basics of deterrence under this administration. When Vladimir Putin threatened to use nuclear weapons, which he did early on in the conflict, we backed away as if we didn't have them. And I think that's a mistake. I mean, rule number one of deterrence is that if somebody says they've got nuclear weapons, you reply as the United States, so do we. And if you use yours, ours probably work better than yours, so you'd better look out. And we've forgotten that. So I think we'd have to assume that a Harris presidency would continue with the de-escalation mantra, failing to support Ukraine enough. How is there ever going to be a negotiation to end this war if Russia is winning? People don't negotiate peace or even an armistice if they're winning. The big difference, I think, is that at least some of the time, and I wouldn't say it was all of the time, Donald Trump gives the impression that he understands that you have to increase the costs of this war to Putin to bring it to an end. He knows, read The Art of the Deal, that he's not going to get a settlement of the war if Russia is winning. Why would Putin settle? And people who are close to Trump, Robert O'Brien, for example, who was his national security advisor, or Mike Pompeo, who was his Secretary of State, have made it explicit that they think the right move would be to increase the pressure on Russia. In other words, increase the supply of weapons to Ukraine and remove the restrictions. Let me just illustrate what that means. Right now, Ukraine has weapons like Storm Shadow missiles from the UK and France, which it cannot use against Russian targets because the US won't allow it. And that includes Russian targets like air bases from which the Russians launched the air raids that are currently destroying Ukraine's energy infrastructure. That's crazy. If Ukraine cannot keep the lights on and the heating on this winter, many Ukrainians are going to leave the country and maybe never come back. So I think a big difference between Harris and Trump is that with Trump, there is some chance that Ukraine will be able to take the gloves off and apply some real military pressure on Russia. And that's the only way you're ever going to get a negotiated end to this conflict. I can't guarantee that that's what Trump would do, but I find it hard to imagine, very, very hard to imagine, that a Trump administration would simply hand Ukraine to Putin with a ribbon tied around it, because that would be such a huge win, not just for Russia, but also for China and for Iran and for North Korea, all of just supporting the Russian war effort right now. I'm not sure, but I would be very surprised if a Trump administration handed such a win to this axis of authoritarians that the United States now very clearly confronts. And I thought it was very interesting that in his interview with Elon Musk, earlier this year, Trump made it clear that he understood this fundamental geopolitical problem. It's not like the war in Ukraine is just one separate regional conflict, and the war in the Middle East is a separate regional conflict, and Taiwan is another separate conflict. Gradually, it's dawned on Republicans in the last 12 months that it's all interconnected, because without Chinese support and Iranian support and North Korean support, there's no way Russia would still be able to wage the war on this scale. And similarly, without China buying Iran's oil, how is Iran still even in business as a regime? I think it's been a very important shift in Republican thinking that the isolationists have kind of lost this argument. The Tucker Carlson faction feels to me much less influential than it was a year ago. The realization in the mind of someone like Speaker Mike Johnson that if Russia wins, which would be the inevitable consequence of our cutting off aid permanently to Ukraine, all the bad guys win. That realization was a very important turning point. And that's why I think if you've got to choose, if it really is simple as Harris or Trump, if you care about Ukraine, and if you care about Israel, and if you care about Taiwan, has to be a big gamble to expect Kamala Harris to do a better job than Joe Biden, who's done a terrible job.